All right, welcome to the Healthy Human Revolution podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Marbus, and today I'm so honored to welcome Dr. David Jenkins. How are you today, sir?
Very well, thank you. And you?
I am very good. Thank you very much for asking.
Good.
Well, you are a pioneer in nutritional research, and I'm just so tickled to speak to you today. And could you give us just a little bit of background about you and why you chose to go into medicine to begin with? I think that really helps people understand your process and your life story.
Well, my granny was the reason I went into medicine. I put a Band-Aid on a cut on her finger when I was 4 years old, and she said, "You will make a great doctor, and you have lots of other people in the family who've been doctors before you for many generations, so you should go and become a doctor." So that was it.
So it all started when you were 4 and your granny's a Band-Aid.
Right, that's it.
Well, I love it. And it sounds like you've been helping people along the way for many years.
Trying to put Band-Aids on things.
I understand. I understand. So as far as you have 6 generations of physicians in your family, is that right?
That's what my granny told me. I never question anything she says.
That's a smart man. See, you were trained early.
Very.
Oh my goodness. So you're originally from the UK?
Yes. Well,
Right.
originally from Wales, I guess, but
Okay.
my mother's side also came from Holland.
Oh, wonderful.
And she married someone who was in Britain, whose family came from Normandy. So I'm not quite sure where I come from exactly.
Well, it sounds like some interesting family history for sure.
Right.
And how did you end up in nutritional research? So you have a PhD and an MD. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about your medical history and your training?
Well, I was encouraged to do research, and Bob Good, who was he's from Toronto, was in the same lab in Oxford as I was. And he said, why didn't I look at, if I was wanting to lower serum cholesterol and prevent heart disease, why didn't I look at a plant-based diet or a more plant-based diet? Because he'd been looking at that in Toronto with Dr. Alec Little, who was the sort of doyen of lipidology in Canada, and had been part of the lipid research clinic's trials that first established that cholesterol was a major factor that, when it was reduced the risk of heart disease. So that was back in the sort of 1980s, late 1970s, 1980s. So Bob suggested that I should do this. I thought it was a good idea, and I did, and it worked. During my training, I was attached to, or had great admiration for Francis Avery Jones, who was, again, one of the leaders in gastroenterology worldwide. He was friends with Dennis Burkitt, who was of Burkitt's lymphoma, but also dietary fibre. And so I got to know Dennis Burkitt quite well. And Dennis thought that we should be working on dietary fibre. So he managed to convince Richard Doll, and Richard Doll's wife, Richard Doll of smoking fame, of tobacco and cancer fame. And his wife was very high in the British Medical Research Council, and the British Medical Research Council decided that they would make a major push to investigate dietary fibre. And so when I qualified in medicine, I went to work as a research scientist with the Medical Research Council looking at dietary fibre. John Cummings, who was my colleague there, worked more on the colon, and I worked more on the small intestine. So obviously that took one from, well, not obviously, but it took one from an interest in cholesterol lowering to an expanded interest on dietary fibre and blood glucose metabolism and diabetes, because these were also things that were thought to be relevant to dietary fibre intake. And so my life really just continued on that vein. It was never anything very dramatic. It just continued to evolve. I met a lot of very clever people and benefited from that. And that's really as far as the story goes. It really just went into carbohydrate, dietary fibre, and then perhaps later on, the glycemic index, which we developed, to be honest, because we saw that there was a lot of negative press for carbohydrate. And the negative press for carbohydrate put as the alternative to carbohydrate meat and animal fat consumption. And we felt that this certainly didn't seem to be right. Cholesterol and saturated fat and red meat were not necessarily seen by us to be high on the list of things you'd feed to people at risk of heart disease. Anyway, that was the message that was beginning to be developed. And so we felt, let's look at the carbohydrate foods more closely. And we looked at their glycemia and we saw that they were all different, and that many of the foods that had a low glycemic index that raised the blood glucose not that much were very healthy foods like peas, beans, lentils, bulgur, couscous, these sorts of things. Very often traditionally processed foods like pumpernickel bread. And so we thought, well, these should really be brought back into the diet instead of being pushed out of the diet. And that was really the beginning of designing those sorts of diets that had low glycemic indices and looking at what they did. And with that, obviously, the dietary fibre story was also developed because many of these foods were high in fibre and they lowered serum cholesterol. So it looked as if one could do two things at once. One could reduce diabetes problems and also solve the cholesterol problem. So that's why we've spent the time developing those sort of diets over the past 20 years or so. And I think they work, and they're very similar in many respects to the Mediterranean diet that has had a lot of good press, which is again is a diet high in fruit, vegetables, low in meat, a lot of vegetable oils, not animal oils. So, and I think the healthy eating index also would give you that particular aspect of nutrition, and so would the Harvard Healthy Eating Index, which is again another more plant-based approach to nutrition. So I think we're beginning to see the plant-based approaches to nutrition taking shape. At the same time, another important driver for dietary change has come on the horizon, and that's the concept of the environment. And people are worried now, I think much more, and rightly so, about the impact of our feeding practices on the environment. And so again, these diets could be encouraged for that reason, that they're environmentally friendly. And I think more and more younger people are being concerned about the treatment of animals. And I think that the humanitarian approach is also another good reason for dietary change. So we really have three sets of good reasons: a health reason, an environmental reason, and a humanitarian reason. So I think all those reasons really should be brought together to support one another in making humans change the way that they're feeding. And I think things, I used to feel I was out on a limb a little bit with this, but I now feel that I'm not particularly out on a limb. And I think that what one's seeing in the journals, the Eat Lancet with Walt Willett and the big attention that they've drawn to the impact of diet and sustainability. I think that these are all important features, and they've now become much more mainstream. So I think we're still trying to find out whether we can increase bile acid losses, whether we can reduce postprandial glycemia, whether we can reduce hemoglobin A1C. We're still looking at the sort of markers of these diets that may produce health and trying to see how we can maximize them. And I have no question in my own mind, just as I think Dr. Willett has, that you can have a healthy plant-based diet or an unhealthy plant-based diet. And I think we've got to try and look at these diets critically and see how we can maximize the amount of health that we can extract from these diets. But I would say that I think, for me, there's been a major shift in the focus of the way one looks at nutrition. And that's really that one should be thinking of not what diet is healthiest for us, but what diet is healthiest for the planet and is also healthiest for us. But I think now the planet must come first, other creatures must come first, and we, with our tremendous ability to eat an enormous range of different foods, must select those foods which are healthy for us, but have a primary fat function on a planetary scale. So that, I think, is a change in thinking for me.
I think that's a wonderful change. It's a win-win-win for all of us involved.
Well, I hope so. It may be a little bit of a lose for some of us because, I mean, you know, there are plenty of people in Texas who want to eat a 32-ounce steak. And if you can eat it in such a short period of time, you get it free. So, you know, a lot of people are going to be disappointed. But I mean, we may have to give up a little in order to do more.
Right. And I think that's where it's so important that an industry, they start looking at ways to pivot their business. Like there's a dairy in New York and a dairy in California that are moving towards plant-based milks, which is incredible.
This is good.
Yes. And, but it was interesting. I interviewed Dr. Neil Bernard yesterday, and, you know, he mentioned that the dairy consumption has dropped precipitously in the last few years, but now we're seeing a rise. They take that milk and turn it into cheese. So can you describe to us a little bit what happens when we consume highly saturated foods, fat foods like cheese in the human body and what the health effects are?
Well, you don't get any effects of poison. These have been traditional foods of ours probably for 10, 12,000 years since the agricultural revolution. So these foods, none of these foods are toxic, and eaten in small amounts, I don't think they make a major impact on health that we can detect. Certainly not detect easily. But I think human beings never do things in a small way. We like to do things big. We like to run a 3-minute mile. We like to have a car that goes at 200 miles an hour. We like things bigger. And if somebody says, come to brunch for all you can eat, everyone goes. So we don't do things in small ways. So that's why I think that we would steer people away from these foods, simply because when you take them in large amounts, they certainly do seem over the long term to not have the benefits that you would have if you took a plant-based diet. And I think that's the important thing. It's the fact that they're not acutely dangerous that allows people to say, well, why can't we just go on? And I think that's a pity, but that's the way things are. But then again, I think that's when one would bring in the concept of the environment and bring in the concept of humanity in the way that we eat, because those would direct us away from even small amounts of these sorts of foods. Which may not be harmful. We may not be harmful. I'm just saying they're not harmful. They're in very small amounts. That's what people have got away with eating for a long period of time. Whether we can do better on plant-based diets will, I think, depend on the research that we have ongoing and often not very well funded, I have to say. So that is the problem. I don't think we've got the data to show whether you can have 2 or 3 cubes of cheese a day or not. That would be a difficult call to make. On the other hand, if there are 10 billion of us and we're all having a few quarters of cheese, how many calves do you have to deprive from their maternal milk? And how much veal do you have to produce to offset the cost? So to make your whole dairy industry cheaper. And I think that's been the great worry. It's a great worry in the past with vegetarians who quite reasonably thought that they could have eggs and cheese as long as they didn't kill anything. But the trouble is that the eggs and cheese, and certainly the cheese, require that we take calves and make veal out of them because basically we've got a lot of calves if we've got a lot of pregnant cows that are now no longer pregnant but giving milk. So, and I think that's been a big problem. It's a big problem in parts of the world like India, where you do get a lacto-vegetarian culture, but on the other hand, they've got an excess of calves. And so, unfortunately, although I always thought India was a place one should look to for dietary change, it's okay so far, but then what do they do with the calves? So I think, you know, it's not, the issues are not simple, and they do make changes to agriculture over the face of the planet. So I'm not suggesting we've got simple solutions. It's been very difficult for farmers who've been often funded and given their subsidies for producing more meat, producing more milk, producing more dairy products. And we now say these subsidies shouldn't be given to you. Well, I think if we do that sort of, if we're going to play that sort of a game, we have to help our farming community to transition to production of other foods. And I think that's, one of the things that, one of the many issues that I think we have to deal with when we think, let's go more plant-based. How do we manage to bring everyone with us, not only locally, but internationally? And how do we cope with the different situations and the different scenarios that we see in different parts of the world? This can all be done. It needs a little thought. We just haven't been thinking of it. That's the trouble. We've not been thinking of it. So we've let things just carry on and not bothered too much, assuming that everything is going to turn out okay. But unfortunately, it isn't. And part of the big reason it's not going to turn out okay is because there are just too many of us. And the damage that you did when you were just a small species is incredibly dangerous when we're a large species.
Absolutely. And I think there's just so many things that we're still debating, even in society now. Some people don't believe that, you know, the global warming trends are going to have an ill effect on us. And if they do, they're like, so what? Well, I have 3 children. I think it's a very big deal. And the science, I think, you know, certainly looks towards that, and we should be doing something. I feel like humans are putting on the gas and accelerating the destruction of our environment and such. So could you describe for me what you consider the healthiest diet? Like, what would you include in your diet on a daily basis that you would consider, you know, optimal for human health?
I think that many cultures have got these sort of diets right, or are more friendly to these sorts of diets. So I think the Orient has always been friendly with its tofu and its seitan. So that gives you 2 different, a legume and a cereal protein. And classically, they make a very complete protein. So those can be eaten in meals, I think, with great advantage. I think peas, beans, and lentils have to be brought back into the diet. There is a problem with gas for some people. This is true. And, but on the other hand, once one eats these things on a more regular basis, the gas is very little. And to be honest, we may just have to put up with a little extra gas between friends. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, that may be just one of the things we do. I think that green leafy vegetables are a great source of pleasure if they're cooked properly. Anything from red chard right the way through to bok choy. These are all enjoyable things that people can eat. In fact, Cicero, the great Roman Republican, in the sort of 2nd to 3rd century BC, introduced the cabbage to Roman culinary art, which is good. So it's been in for a while. And he was a great believer that cabbage was a great restorer of health. So, I mean, for a long time, we've had ideas about what plant foods may be useful. I mean, in the Bible, the so-called mess of pottage from the King James Version was apparently a lentil soup. And if you could give up your inheritance for a lentil soup, it was obviously something highly prized. So I think throughout history, we've got an indication that these foods are good. And obviously the Indian literature and the Indian traditional medicine has relied a lot on plants, plant foods, and these sort of things. And I'm quite sure that when Hippocrates said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food, he wasn't referring to beefsteak. So I think this has been a long tradition of useful food. So I do think the legumes, I think, are very, very important. I think whole grain cereals and their proteins are important. I think many of the grains that we get now from Latin America are very useful too. And these are new, and people who have some gluten sensitivity can eat these without any concerns at all. So I don't think things have to contain gluten, although to be honest, for 95% of our population, they're extremely good foods. Mm-hmm. So it is only a more limited group, 1% perhaps with celiac and 5% with gluten intolerance, who may have some particular concern. Celiac, yes, gluten intolerance to some extent. So I think that whole grain cereals are good. I think that fruit and vegetables are excellent. In general, the non-starchy ones are excellent. And then starchy ones such as sweet potatoes, yams, these sort of things. We don't eat these sorts of foods, but we should do. And there are other vegetables too, vegetables which have a lot of sticky fibers in them. Things like okra, eggplant. These are very good foods. People don't even know about them. So you talk about those. Have you eaten okra? No, what's okra? So, I mean, there's so many foods in this category which are healthy, and most of them are. If one takes these foods in a less processed form, when I say less, I mean obviously tofu is a processed food. Bread is a processed, whole wheat bread is a processed food. I think that the processing of tofu was a discovery, if you like, and I think a useful one. The use of seitan is a very useful way of preparing wheat gluten for those who can take it, which is the majority of us. So I think these foods are good. In fact, it would be a good thing for you to mention a fruit, vegetable, whole grain cereal, legume, that I could say, oh yes, that's not a good one. Mm. So I would have to again go through a whole encyclopedia of these things if I was to tell you what I think should be included in the diet. Mm. But I do think, and this is quite important, if we look at our ancestors, well, my ancestors, the great apes, our common ancestor. If you look at the other members of our clade, as it were, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the orangutans, these are all high fiber eater. they're high fiber eaters, and they have a large variety of different foods they eat. The leaves, the stems, and the shoots come from a wide variety of plants. We're the ones with a very restricted diet, largely beef and wheat. If you think of most of the foods, no, not you, but most of the foods that people around you are eating, they're variants of those things, whether it's a steak, it's a burger, whether it's dogs, whether it's whatever it is, and whether it's a bun, whether it's a pizza, whatever it is, it's wheat. And then we've got our cheese and our milk, which also comes from our cattle. So we are dependent on cattle and wheat. And I think that's really a very limited diet when you think of the wide range of diet that we would have evolved on.
How long have you been eating a plant-based diet? Like, how long have you been eating the plant-based diet, and what was your realization that you need to transition, or did you always eat a plant-based diet?
I changed to a vegetarian diet when I was 11. And that was because I was presented with some pets that were mine as Christmas food. And there were 2 small birds that were my pets. It wasn't my parents who did it. It was a well-meaning aunt who'd been looking after these pets for me. But they appeared in a Christmas hamper one Christmas when I was 11. And as you can imagine, that was a downer. And I got to thinking, because I used to be, from the age of about 6 to 10, I was quite a hunter. And when we killed animals, or didn't kill them, we wounded animals, we brought them home and tried to nurse them back to good health. So had I had more brains at the time, I would have thought even at that time, well, that's a silly thing to do. Why bother? Why not just let them be healthy to start with? So, but anyway, all those things came to bear when I was about 11 at Christmas. And that was when I decided that this was not a good idea and I should stop eating animals. And so at that point, I stopped eating animals. To my mother's dismay, my father not being a doctor, I think my mother would have been extremely upset. He thought it was not a good idea and that I would fall apart. I wouldn't grow properly. Anyway, so fast forward to the age of about 59. And I'd been eating more plant-based. I then thought at about 59, I really should make a change. I should get rid of leather shoes. I should get rid of woolen clothing. And I should stop eating honey and these sorts of things and leave myself independent of the animal world as best I can. Lead their own lives I mine. And so that's been going on for 59. At the time, we went in that direction. My 2 daughters were brought up by us as vegetarians. They obviously were allowed, they could buy what they want, they could eat what they want, but they felt that was a good idea, I think, as soon as they were in that mode. And then they were much brighter than I am, because by the time they were sort of 26, 27, they decided to go vegan. So they were probably sort of 30 years quicker than I was in getting to the idea. So I have to give them credit for that. And then my wife, who'd been a vegetarian after she met me and up to the time that I changed, when the girls changed, she decided that was time for her too. So without any particular proselytization, we've got a family who are vegan. That's how it is.
So it started when you were 11. We had a little cutout there from it. So it started when you were 11, when your aunt, good meaning, killed two of your pet birds and presented them for dinner for Christmas. And then you said your mother and your dad were quite.
My mother was very worried. My dad said, "Don't worry." My dad was a physician, so he said, "Don't worry," to my mum, as long as he eats a good diet. My mum was not sure.
So what year was that then that you decided to go vegetarian?
Wow. So that would be probably about 1953, 54.
Wow. So did the word vegetarian even exist at that point?
Oh yeah. George Bernard Shaw had been a vegetarian.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, and interestingly, Milton had been a vegetarian way back in the 1600s. There was a big tradition I have to say, in Britain, of being vegetarian. And I think it had probably come from the fact that the British had been in India for such a long while. And so this was not an unusual thing for them. So they were the one Western culture, because they'd been they strongly had an integration with a culture which was vegetarian, meant that a lot of these ideas were not new.
Wow. So now you have two daughters. Do they have families? Are they also vegan?
They have boyfriends, but who tend to be at least more plant-based.
More plant. So no grandchildren?
No.
Okay.
We're trying not to overload the planet.
I understand. I understand. So now, are any of them physicians? Did they carry on the generational tradition?
No, I think they realize that this has not been a tremendous success. So one studied environmental science and the other psychology.
Okay.
Both of which are very important if one's going to transition to a more plant-based diet.
100%. I have one in medicine. She's in medical school now. So it's,
there you are.
yes, absolutely.
What sort of diet does she follow?
All three of my children are vegan, and my husband.
Super. You arrived perfect.
We arrived. Well, it took us a little bit. It's been about 8 years. So it took us some time. But as far as, I would like to just kind of go back to the glycemic index. So of course, this was, looking at foods and carbohydrates and the response of blood sugar in the blood, for those who don't understand what that is. Is there any research on foods that cause a rise of insulin? Like, because my understanding is that, fats can cause, a rise in insulin. Or is there any type of research like that showing that maybe meat or dairy cause an elevated rise of insulin and therefore make you have
higher I think
glucose?
if you have proteins generally increase insulin secretion. They also increase glucagon secretion, but they secrete, so you get an increase in insulin secretion. And so there's been some concern that is it just the protein component of the foods that is responsible through increased insulin secretion for the apparent beneficial effects that we see. And I think one can say probably not, but it's rather that plant proteins, along with starch, tend to slow the digestion rate of starchy foods. And so you have a more slow release carbohydrate in your gastrointestinal tract, giving you a flatter rise in blood glucose rather than a steep rise.
As far as the portfolio diet, what was what on your portfolio diet, what was the impetus to name it portfolio, and what does it consist of exactly?
Well, for a long time, I was working on different things like dietary fibre, things like plant sterols, things like nuts, and things like viscous fibre. And my wife said, why don't you just put them all together? I mean, why look at them independently? Why put them together? You might get something more impressive. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, that's, of course, that's obvious, that's sensible. So we did, and we thought, well, how do we sell this? Because you're always meant to have one thing. You show that nuts do good things to blood glucose. You show that sticky fibers do good things to serum cholesterol. You find that plant sterols also lower serum cholesterol. So you've got viscous fibers lowering cholesterol, plant sterols lowering cholesterol, nuts lowering cholesterol. Well, they all lower cholesterol, but they all do it by somewhat different means. Do you know what I mean? So why don't we just call it a portfolio like the financial portfolio? You're trying to fill it with things that are good, so that you balance off your perhaps losses of doing something else with something that may not work quite as well for someone. So you have a portfolio. You build up your own portfolio of foods that you like that will then give you a big effect in terms of the end goal is, which is to lower serum cholesterol. So that's really what we did. I mean, we just looked at things like vegetable proteins, tofu, soy, viscous fibers, as I say, oats, barley, psyllium type cereals, nuts, plant sterol margarines, enriched margarines. Put all those things together, then you can get a statin-like effect if people eat just what they're meant to eat. Obviously, if you tell them to go and shop at the supermarket and buy these things, because you can get all these things in the supermarket, they will probably get about 40 to 50% of the effect, which is still good, because if you are getting a 30% or a 28% reduction in LDL cholesterol, just getting a 14 to 15% reduction in LDL cholesterol, for many people is all they need. So we feel that it will, and if they're on drugs, it will stop them having to increase the drug dosage, at which dosage you may see some side effects, whereas at a lower dosage you may not. So again, it may have use for those who are already on medications and those who are threatened with medications.
Absolutely. So that's kind of...
those who just want to eat a regular diet. Why not?
Yes, absolutely. So you're seeing that marriage of medicine and the diet, and then you get even a better effect, a more amplified effect of the dietary cholesterol lowering effects. Wonderful. So you mentioned viscous fiber. For those who are not familiar, can you talk to us a little bit about the different types of fiber?
And barley and psyllium. If you've ever eaten oatmeal or ever cooked oatmeal, you note that it gets sticky. If you've ever eaten foods like okra, vegetables like okra, if you boil it, you notice that there's a syrup at the bottom which is sticky. And you even get that with eggplant. If you boil it, you get something sticky at the bottom. These are the sticky types of fiber, and they tend to trap bile acids in the bile, and the bile acid, and wash them into the colon. And that's the way that you lose cholesterol from the body.
Could you repeat that? Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, there was a little cutout in our connection. You said something about the stickiness in the eggplant, and then what happens? I'm sorry.
If you have sticky fibers in foods, what they do is they reduce the absorption of bile acids from the intestine, especially the lower part of the small intestine, the terminal ileum, where you normally absorb your bile acids. Bile acids then are washed out into the feces. They're not to any great extent reabsorbed. If that's the case, then the body has to make bile acids because you need that to emulsify fats and things in your small intestine. So it draws on the cholesterol, especially the cholesterol in your circulation. It draws on that cholesterol as the skeleton for making the bile acids. So then you'll lower your cholesterol levels. And you wash out the bile acids in the feces into the pot. So that way cholesterol is lost from the body.
Excellent. So, and then are the additional, what other types of effects, or you said there were multiple mechanisms of lowering cholesterol. So the viscous fiber is
Fiber
one.
mechanism. Then the plants, the plant sterols, what they do is they block cholesterol absorption, not bile acids, but cholesterol. And so they take cholesterol itself out of the body. And your bile, you secrete quite a lot of cholesterol from your bile, which may be reabsorbed. It's not if you have these agents that block cholesterol absorption, known as the plant sterols. And you find them in oils and leafy vegetables normally. But you can concentrate them up and then feed them in a margarine or some other food form. And you can get
Sorry, you just cut out again. What was that last part that you said?
You wash out bile acids. You wash out cholesterol itself.
So
with nuts, you can do all of the above.
Okay.
It says low system resources may affect your audio quality. Try closing some applications to improve performance.
I think we're okay. We're closing in on, I know you have a certain amount of time left. So you said also, so nuts, is there any particular nuts in particular that worked better than others?
It's interesting. I think nuts in general seem to work. The nuts that have been most studied are basically almonds, walnuts, and perhaps to some extent pistachios.
Okay. Excellent. So walnuts, almonds, pistachios, dark green leafies, plant sterols, our viscous fiber, all of that would lead to healthier outcomes, hopefully decreased risk of cardiac events.
Yes.
Excellent. And as far as the last little few minutes we have here, is there any advice that you would like to share with the audience if maybe they're considering a plant-based diet? Do you have any suggestions or thoughts or last words you'd like to share?
Well, I think there are quite a lot of books that are now being written, and that those are very good. They should look for books that are written on plant-based diet so they get some feel for it. I think that they should also
look at what? I'm sorry?
Plant-based restaurants.
Oh, restaurants. I gotcha.
You can eat out, and the eating out may be very valuable in giving ideas. People get a lot of ideas, especially if they go to different cultures. So Chinese vegetarian restaurants, see what the Chinese do with tofu, see what they do with seitan. That'll give you a lot of ideas if you need them. I think that's important, to actually learn what you're doing and actually taste what you're doing. You can read about it and people can talk to you about it, but when you taste it, you understand whether it's the sort of thing that you're going to like. And I think that's important. I don't know whether you can ask the restaurant's chef to give you some ideas on how to cook it, but at least you'll get lots of ideas on the sort of foods that can be produced. I think that's important. And then I think there are other resources. I think Neil Barnard's group, the Physicians for Responsible Medicine, will have lots of ideas and probably even be able to direct people to physicians in a particular geographic area who may be useful to monitor people while they're on these diets. I would suggest that a talk to or some talk with a dietitian who knows about these diets is very useful, very helpful. And I think to have some blood measures monitored by a physician who's interested in this sort of medicine would also be very helpful. If you're going entirely plant-based, you then need to be careful of B12. So it's worth having a B12 measurement before and then after about 6 months or a year on the diet, and then have annual measurements just to see that your B12 is right. And that's the only thing on a balanced plant-based diet that you're likely to be lacking. That's a concern.
Right, absolutely. So I'm always encourage people to take the B12. It's a very simple, I tell people eat optimally and then supplement wisely. And that usually...
Yes, and I think that the B12 is produced by bacteria, so it's perfectly acceptable for vegans to have a supplement of B12. Probably we never needed B12 in the past because we never washed our food. And the dirt contains a lot of B12. The topsoil of the earth contains a lot of B12. Our feces are laden with B12.
Yes, absolutely. And the water, I'm assuming, would have the bacteria that would have the B12 as well?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, well, Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much. We said 45 minutes and we're at that here already. And I do appreciate your time. And it was a delight speaking to you today.
Well, thank you. And I hope it's of some use. I don't know what you're going to do with all this.
I am going to share it with the world, sir, and let them enjoy it and learn from your wisdom.
You'll probably have to cut it down to 2 or 3 minutes. Otherwise, nobody will watch.
I'm pretty sure many people will watch and listen. I think you'll be surprised.
But you've got a whole load of other people who've already done this too.
Yes, you're my goodness. You'll be around 175 interviews that I've done so far.
Good heavens.
I do enjoy speaking to people and just learning from their experience. So this has been a very...
if I'm your 175th, I think that they'll never get round to me.
No, those are already published. So you'll be in the next queue in the next week or so.
Do you get many hits to this thing? Do you get?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. We get thousands of downloads.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, congratulations. I thought you were going to try and put together a journal that was going to be...
Well, we already have the medical journal that's already published. And so it'll be our 3rd edition in February. And Dr. Williams is our editor-in-chief.
Isn't that good? Do you do it monthly?
We do it we were working on twice a year. We're working towards quarterly as our goal. So we're hoping next year will be 3 and then moving to quarterly thereafter. But the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention, which we've contacted you about before. So
I know.
Thank you.
Good. Well done.
Thank you so much.
I will go and do my other work now, and you must do the same too.
Absolutely. I do have work to do, but you have a beautiful day, sir.
Same to you.
All
Good
right.
weather.
Thank you. You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.